Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, April 21st, day 563 of the war. Amid Rochelle Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
We have an update to the IDF's high-level probe into the March 23rd shooting in Gaza of 15 medics. We will also learn about Lebanese efforts to stop rocket attacks on Israel, even as the Israel Air Force continues airstrikes on southern Lebanon. We'll, of course, update on what is happening in the Gaza Strip and learn who tried to break into the Gaza buffer zone on Sunday. All this and more when we're back. Manny, let's begin with an update into a saga that really made headlines around the world. I'm talking, of course, about the March 23rd shooting of 15 medics in the Gaza Strip and their burial in a shallow grave. So tell us what happened yesterday.
So the army completed its investigation. This investigation was led by the General Staff Fact-Finding Assessment Mechanism, if I got that correctly. It's essentially an independent military body. It's not connected to any specific unit in the army. It's led by Yoav Har-Even, who's a retired general, and he and his team investigate unusual incidents amid the war. So they've completed this investigation. It tells sort of yet another story, another version of what happened, but I think this is the final one. The bottom line is the reason why we've had so many versions of this story already, and every time there's a little bit different information, is because this investigation found that the forces who were involved in this didn't give a accurate, let's say, report during a preliminary investigation. I wouldn't go and say that they lied, but they definitely gave inaccurate information, partial information, that led to the army then repeating that partial information to the public, and that being wrong information. And as a result, punishments have been handed out. So the deputy commander of the Golani Brigade's reconnaissance unit, who was the commanding officer involved in the incident, he's been removed from his position. He's been dismissed. And the commander of the 14th Reserve Armed Brigade, who that's the unit that's sort of was responsible for the operation in the area, has received a rebuke that will go on his permanent record. So he was not being dismissed or anything. But we may see more punishments handed out later, because this investigation has now been handed over to the military advocate general, who will then decide on additional steps, possibly even sort of turning it into something criminal and charging them. But that's yet to be seen. We haven't seen any such incident yet where soldiers have been charged for something like this.
Of course, the autopsy results are coming from the Hamas-run health ministry in the Gaza Strip, but they're pretty dire. They are depicting a picture in which these medics were shot in the head, shot in the chest, really with an intent to kill. Does that match up with the moral code of such an incident, assuming that the soldiers did feel that these medics were a threat or part of the Hamas convoy that had just passed earlier, if I'm not mistaken, at around 6 a.m. in the morning?
So really the probe found that these troops did indeed think that they were under some sort of threat. And it sort of follows another incident earlier, which was also a misidentification. So initially, this vehicle drove past this ambush that the troops had set up just before 4 a.m., and the soldiers thought it was a Hamas police vehicle. Later in the investigation, it's now been revealed to have been actually another ambulance, not a Hamas police vehicle. The troops opened fire on this vehicle. They killed 2 people inside and detained the third person. This third person was held until the morning and then released because they realized he wasn't indeed a Hamas member. But because up until that point they believed that he was a Hamas member and they had opened fire on a Hamas police vehicle, the troops were in this sort of state of mind where they thought that Hamas were going to attack them in the area. Between then and the incident with the medics that we know of, there were some ambulances and fire trucks and civilians that passed through the area. They weren't shot at or anything. The troops were able to distinguish ambulances and fire trucks and civilians passing through the area. What happened at 5:06 a.m., which is when this happened, is the drone operators who were flying aircraft overhead alerted the soldiers that suspicious vehicles were approaching them. They weren't able to determine if they were ambulances or not. These ambulances stopped on the side of the road next to the original ambulance that was hit first, and then several people got out of the vehicles and started running. The commander of the force, the deputy commander of the reconnaissance unit, who's now been dismissed, he was the first one to open fire, and then once the troops opened fire, they basically charged forward and opened fire on this convoy. The odd discrepancy is that in the preliminary investigation, the commander said that he didn't see that these vehicles had their lights on. Of course, we've seen video footage showing that they did have their lights on, these emergency vehicles. The probe finds that from the position where the commander was standing, he was not able to see the ambulance. He was only able to see the fire truck. And according to his claim, he wasn't actually able to see that the lights were on or not. It was very faint, or was some sort of strange angle. That's at least what the probe is saying right now. And then they opened fire, they rushed towards them, and then they realized that they were unarmed medics, and then the soldiers backed off from the area at that point. Not long later, like 15 minutes later or so, a UN vehicle showed up, and the troops identified that it was a UN vehicle. They weren't mistaken by the identity or anything, but they opened fire on this vehicle as well, and killing a UN worker. So the investigation has now found that the first two incidents of them opening fire are, quote, somewhat understandable. They were in this sort of position where they were sort of ready for a Hamas attack. They weren't able to fully identify the vehicles in front of them. But the third incident, where they identified a UN vehicle approaching them and they still opened fire on them, that's one of the big errors in this case, where they exceeded the IDF protocols. They shouldn't have opened fire in that case at all. And the other part of the investigation that found that sort of the troops did something that was against protocol was in the morning, after they had buried the bodies in sand, which is a practice to avoid animals from eating the corpses, the army used a bulldozer to push the vehicles to the side of the road, and in the process they crushed them. And the army, the investigation has said that they shouldn't have done this. This was an error. They should not have crushed these ambulances and vehicles. But for what you asked, whether or not the medics were executed or anything, so the investigation has found that there's no evidence to suggest that they were executed. They were shot at when the troops were rushing towards the scene. They stopped shooting at one point. They didn't continue shooting after. They didn't look for people and execute them afterwards. They didn't tie anybody up, as some of the reports have claimed. There wasn't any time for that to happen. They went there. They were left very quickly. And the army notified the UN immediately. They didn't try to hide the incident. They buried the bodies and marked the burial spot, immediately called the UN. The UN wasn't able to reach the location initially. They found one body and then they came back. But eventually the army helped them find the location of the bodies. So the army wasn't trying to hide anything here. But it does come down to this commander and these soldiers providing an inaccurate testimony of what happened, and then leading to this whole international incident now where nobody's going to trust the army because they're now backtracking on everything that they've said.
Let's turn to Lebanon, where Israeli fighter jets carried out a wave of airstrikes in the southern Lebanon area yesterday afternoon, targeting, of course, Hezbollah rocket launchers and other infrastructure. This comes as the Lebanese Armed Forces themselves are trying to thwart rocket attacks on Israel in really what is the first time we've seen this kind of cooperation. It comes after there were some arrests made last week. It all kind of ties together that there is some kind of, a cell that was attempting to operate against Israel. And we're seeing for the first time here, Manny, real cooperation, really optimistic cooperation, I have to say, between the Lebanese Armed Forces and the IDF. Tell us more about this.
Well, it's indirect cooperation. It's via this American-led committee. And it's important to say that the Lebanese Armed Forces, just the Lebanese Army in short, they've been doing work. They've acted against hundreds of sites already. Sites that Israel has complained about, said, there's a rocket launcher here, there's a cache of weapons here. They've dismounted it and dealt with it. They are relatively weak. They don't have huge manpower, but they are managing to deal with things. And saw last week the Lebanese army detained several people, including several Palestinians who had fired rockets on Israel previously in March. And this is now the first time where the Lebanese army actually detains people before a rocket attack was carried out, and they've linked it to the to the other cell that had launched the rocket. So it's likely not Hezbollah members in this case, but other armed groups, probably Hamas or Islamic Jihad or something linked to Hezbollah. Of course, the ceasefire deal is that no armed groups, apart from the Lebanese army, are allowed to be in southern Lebanon. So we are seeing the Lebanese army step up and work, but when they don't, then Israel knows to carry out strikes. Like the strikes that we saw today, areas that the Lebanese army didn't reach in time, Israel acts against them.
Right. We are recording, of course, quite late on Sunday in order to prepare for your trip into Gaza tomorrow. So let's talk about your trip into Gaza tomorrow and what's happening on the ground in Gaza when we're back. So on Saturday, for the first time since the IDF resumed its offensive against Hamas in the Strip on March 18th, a soldier was killed inside the Strip. And the deadly incident took place as the IDF was again trying to broaden the buffer zone that we've been discussing for the past several weeks. And Manny, you're bringing a statistic now that approximately 30% of Gaza is now part of that buffer zone. Is that correct, Manny?
Yeah, it's 30%, if not already more by now, of Gaza. It's mostly in the Rafah area, so basically the entire city of Rafah will soon be part of the buffer zone, an area stretching from the Egyptian border all the way to the outskirts of Khan Yunis. And across the entire, along the border between Israel and Gaza, around 2 kilometers into the Strip is now or will be part of the buffer zone soon enough. And this incident that happened on Saturday in the morning and early afternoon hours was very close to the Israeli border in the buffer zone near Bet Hanun, not during sort of offensive activity or anything. It wasn't the army attacking some Hamas stronghold anywhere. It was during routine operations in this buffer zone. The soldiers were working on a tunnel there that were trying to uncover and destroy. And from this tunnel, from a nearby tunnel, Hamas operatives came out and launched an attack on troops, first wounding 3 female soldiers, and then when the rescue forces arrived, set off a bomb which killed the officer.
Yeah, I think it's surprising to many. I know it was to me that Israel is still finding Hamas terror tunnels and exploding them, blowing them up. And I think for you, it's old news and very blasé. But in the past several weeks, we've seen many incidents of these tunnels being blown up. And is it just something that happens so often that it is just unremarkable at this point, Manny?
I suppose so. I mean, it happens so often, but the sort of interesting statistic that I can give you is that, according to the army, only 25% of Hamas's tunnels in Gaza have been destroyed since the beginning of the war, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the army argues that the main focus has been Hamas's attack tunnels, meaning the ones that reach the border, or the main command centers, or the ones used for weapons manufacturing. Those sort of the high priority tunnels have been destroyed, and then Hamas has numerous other tunnels that it uses to mainly move around in Gaza. So tunnels that go from Rafah to Khan Yunis, or from Gaza City down to Deir al-Balah, or those kind of tunnels. The army hasn't focused on them as much as the ones where they use to launch attacks or manufacture weapons, or the ones that come close to the Israeli border. But now they are working on all those other tunnels as well, and that's why we're seeing a lot of tunnels in Rafah, for example, being demolished. And just over the weekend, the army demolished like 3 or 4 tunnels in Rafah. They're slowly getting to them. It takes a lot of time to uncover the exact route and to get explosives laid inside. It's a whole long operation. It takes time. So now the army is working on them. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but already hundreds of kilometers of Hamas tunnels have been destroyed in Gaza. I think before the war, and I've spoken to a lot of commanders and I've asked them sort of what surprised you the most about being in Gaza, and they've said that the amount of tunnels. I don't think Israel knew how many tunnels Hamas had initially. I think it estimated that it had a few hundred kilometers worth of tunnels, and it's now discovered that it's already destroyed a few hundred, and it's only reached, let's say, 25% already. So there's a lot more work to go across Gaza.
The other perhaps surprising part of this attack on Saturday is, of course, who was hit. And the person who was killed was a Bedouin tracker, which I think many in our audience abroad, they don't even understand this concept of the Bedouin tracker. And as you mentioned, 3 female soldiers were injured too severely, and they are fighters inside Gaza. So that is also perhaps surprising. So tell us just briefly about this Bedouin tracker unit in the army.
Right, so Warrant Officer Ghaleb Sliman al-Sansara, he's in the Gaza Division's Northern Brigade. So the Northern Brigade has a small unit of trackers that is just sort of part of the brigade. In the Southern Brigade, so the Gaza Division's other unit, they have the sort of official, it's called the Bedouin Patrol Unit or the Bedouin Reconnaissance Unit. It's a much larger unit, and they're responsible for most of the tracking efforts on the Gaza border, looking for sort of footprints or areas that suspects have gone through. They do quite a lot of work. Even before the war, they were doing a lot of work on the border, and especially during the war. And during the war as well, several of their members, of the unit, have been killed on October 7. Several members of both in the trackers unit in the south part of the border and in the northern part of the border were killed. But they're not really on the front lines. Usually they're normally behind doing other operations. The 3 female soldiers who were wounded are all part of the combat intelligence collection array, so they were also doing surveillance operations, so they were not on the front lines. But still, there's huge danger even in these in the clearing operations, where the army has already gone through and defeated Hamas's forces there and now is looking for the tunnels. Hamas members are still able to sort of sneak around, stay in certain tunnels, prepare attacks on troops. And we've seen several cases like this during the war where soldiers think they're in an area which is, I guess, relatively safe, and then they come under attack by Hamas. The 3 soldiers were in an unarmored vehicle. It wasn't an armored personnel carrier or a tank or anything like that. It was just a regular jeep that would drive, and it's sort of normal in those areas because you don't expect Hamas to be there.
Which is really unsettling, in part also because of this final segment that we'll discuss, which is that several Israelis attempted to cross into the Gaza Strip through the buffer zone. And this is not the first time. Manny, I know we don't have many details about this, but what are you able to tell us about these Israelis trying to cross into the Gaza Strip?
I don't have much this time, unfortunately. It's sort of just happening now. But a group of Israelis tried to enter Gaza. I think they crossed the fence, but they didn't reach Gaza territory because the Israeli fence is sort of built inside Israel. So there is a few hundred meters before you actually reach Gaza territory. They were detained by soldiers. They were handed over to police. And again, not the first incident. There was something that happened also, I think, a week ago or so. And several suspects in that case did actually manage to reach Gaza territory and enter Gaza. The army went to the scene and took them and sent them back, handed them over to police. I don't think I've seen any indictments files in these cases yet, but police have said that sort of crossing an international border illegally is punishable up to 4 years in prison, if I'm not mistaken. There were lots of cases on the Lebanon border that happened in recent months. The army's deployed in southern Lebanon, but civilians have tried to sneak over the border. The army isn't normally watching those areas, but it does end up capturing them, and it's a bit of a problem when the army sort of deployed forward. Then it doesn't really monitor the fence as much as it would sort of from that direction, people going in, not the other way around, of course.
Now, Manny, you yourself are meant to go in, which is, as I mentioned, why we're recording the night before. We generally do record on the day that we release the episode. And can you tell us briefly what you are meant to see before we actually get the report from you later in the day?
Right, so I'm going back to the Morag corridor again. This newly established corridor. The army's in the middle of building it, but it's between Rafah and Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. It runs sort of parallel to the Philadelphia corridor, the Egypt-Gaza border area. I was there not long ago, about 2 weeks ago, with the defense minister. So this time I'm with IDF officers instead. And we're going to see what the army's doing, how they're establishing this road, what sort of things they're finding in that area. I already know that the army's found several tunnels there and Hamas infrastructure there, things that they're working on now to destroy. So we'll go and we'll see what exactly it is that they're doing, what the progress looks like on this road, whether or not they've begun to already lay the asphalt on parts of it.
So watch this spot for further updates, and please check out our live blog, obviously. Manny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.